Apple and the satellite-based broadband service Starlink each recently took steps to address new research into the potential security and privacy implications of how their services geolocate devices. Researchers from the University of Maryland say they relied on publicly available data from Apple to track the location of billions of devices globally, including non-Apple devices like Starlink systems, and found they could use this data to monitor the destruction of Gaza, as well as the movements and, in many cases, identities of Russian and Ukrainian troops. At issue is the way that Apple collects and publicly shares information about the precise location of all Wi-Fi access points seen by its devices. Apple collects this location data to give Apple devices a crowdsourced, low-power alternative to constantly requesting Global Positioning System (GPS) coordinates. Both Apple and Google operate their own Wi-Fi-based positioning systems (WPS) that obtain certain hardware identifiers from all wireless access points that come within range of their mobile devices. Both record the media access control MAC address that a Wi-Fi access point uses, known as a Basic Service Set Identifier or BSID. Periodically, Apple and Google mobile devices will forward their locations by querying GPS and/or by using cellular towers as landmarks along with any nearby BSIDs. This combination of data allows Apple and Google devices to figure out where they are within a few feet or meters. And it's what allows your mobile phone to continue displaying your planned route even when the device can't get a fix on GPS. With Google's WPS, a wireless device submits a list of nearby Wi-Fi access point SIDs and their signal strength via an application programming interface API request to Google, whose WPS responds with the device's computed position. Google's WPS requires at least two SIDs to calculate a device's approximate position. Apple's WPS also accepts a list of nearby BSIDs, but instead of computing the device's location based off the set of observed access points and their received signal strengths and then reporting that result to the user, Apple's API will return the geolocations of up to 400 more BSIDs that are nearby the one requested. It then uses approximately 8 of those BSIDs to work out the user's location based on known landmarks. In essence, Google's WPS computes the user's location and shares it with the device. Apple's WPS gives its devices a large enough amount of data about the location of known access points in the area that the devices can do that estimation on their own. That's according to two researchers at the University of Maryland, who theorized they could use the verbosity of Apple's API to map the movement of individual devices into and out of virtually any defined area of the world. The pair said they spent a month early in their research continuously querying the API, asking it for the location of more than 1 billion BSIDs generated at random. They learned that while only about 3 million of those randomly generated BSIDs were known to Apple's Wi-Fi geolocation API, Apple also returned an additional 488 million BSID locations already stored in its WPS from other lookups. Associate Professor David Levin and PhD student Eric Rye found they could mostly avoid requesting unallocated BSIDs by consulting the list of BSID ranges assigned to specific device manufacturers. That list is maintained by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers IEE, which is also sponsoring the Privacy and Security Conference, where Rye is slated to present the research later today. Plotting the locations returned by Apple's WPS between November 2022 and November 2023, Levin and Rye saw they had a near-global view of the locations tied to more than 2 billion Wi-Fi access points. The map showed geolocated access points in nearly every corner of the globe, apart from almost the entirety of China. Vast stretches of desert wilderness in Central Australia and Africa, and deep in the rainforests of South America. The researchers said that by zeroing in on or geofencing other smaller regions indexed by Apple's location API, they could monitor how Wi-Fi access points moved over time. Why might that be a big deal? They found that by geofencing active conflict zones in Ukraine, they were able to determine the location and movement of Starlink devices used by both Ukrainian and Russian forces. The reason they were able to do that is that each Starlink terminal, the dish and associated hardware that allows a Starlink customer to receive internet service from a constellation of orbiting Starlink satellites, includes its own Wi-Fi access point, whose location is going to be automatically indexed by any nearby Apple devices that have location services enabled. The University of Maryland team geo-fenced various conflict zones in Ukraine and identified at least 3,720 Starlink terminals geolocated in Ukraine. We find what appear to be personal devices being brought by military personnel into war zones, exposing pre-deployment sites and military positions, the researchers wrote. Our results also show individuals who have left Ukraine to a wide range of countries, validating public reports of where Ukrainian refugees have resettled. In an interview with Krebson Security, the team said they found that in addition to exposing Russian troop pre-deployment sites, the location data made it easy to see where devices in contested regions originated from. This includes residential addresses throughout the world. Levin said, "We even believe we can identify people who have joined the Ukraine Foreign Legion." Levin and Rai said they shared their findings with Starlink in March 2024, and that Starlink told them the company began shipping software updates in 2023 that forced Starlink access points to randomize their PSIDs. Starlink's parent SpaceX did not respond to requests for comment, but the researchers shared a graphic they said was created from their Starlink PSID monitoring data, which shows that just in the past month there was a substantial drop in the number of Starlink devices that were geolocatable using Apple's API. In early 2023, a software update was released that randomized the main router PSID. Subsequent software releases have included randomization of the PSID of Wi-Fi repeaters associated with the main router. Software updates that include the repeater randomization functionality are currently being deployed fleet-wide on a region-by-region basis. We believe the data outlined in your paper is based on Starlink main routers and/or repeaters that were queried prior to receiving these randomization updates. The researchers also focused their geofencing on the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, and were able to track the migration and disappearance of devices throughout the Gaza Strip as Israeli forces cut power to the country and bombing campaigns knocked out key infrastructure. As time progressed, the number of Gazan PSIDs that are geolocatable continued to decline, they wrote. By the end of the month, only 28% of the original PSIDs were still found in the Apple WPS. In late March 2024, Apple quietly updated its website to note that anyone can opt out of having the location of their wireless access points collected and shared by Apple by appending no map to the end of the Wi-Fi access point's name SID. Adding no map to your Wi-Fi network name also blocks Google from indexing its location. Asked about the changes, Apple said they have respected the no map flag on SIDs for some time, but that this was only called out in a support article earlier this year. Rai said Apple's response addressed the most depressing aspect of their research, that there was previously no way for anyone to opt out of this data collection. You may not have Apple products, but if you have an access point and someone near you owns an Apple device, your PSID will be in Apple's database, he said. What's important to note here is that every access point is being tracked, without opting in, whether they run an Apple device or not. Only after we disclosed this to Apple have they added the ability for people to opt out. The researchers said they hope Apple will consider additional safeguards, such as proactive ways to limit abuses of its location API. It's a good first step, Levin said of Apple's privacy update in March, but this data represents a really serious privacy vulnerability. I would hope Apple would put further restrictions on the use of its API, like rate limiting these queries to keep people from accumulating massive amounts of data like we did. The researchers said they omitted certain details from their study to protect the users they were able to track, noting that the methods they used could present risks for those fleeing abusive relationships or stalkers. We observe routers move between cities and countries, potentially representing their owner's relocation or a business transaction between an old and new owner. They wrote, "While there is not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between Wi-Fi routers and users, home routers typically only have several. If these users are vulnerable populations, such as those fleeing intimate partner violence or a stalker, their router simply being online can disclose their new location." The researchers said Wi-Fi access points that can be created using a mobile device's built-in cellular modem do not create a location privacy risk for their users because mobile phone hotspots will choose a random SID when activated. Modern Android and iOS devices will choose a random SID when you go into hotspot mode, he said. Hotspots are already implementing the strongest recommendations for privacy protections. It's other types of devices that don't do that. For example, they discovered that certain commonly used travel routers compound the potential privacy risks because travel routers are frequently used on campers or boats. We see a significant number of them move between campgrounds, RV parks, and marinas, the duo wrote. They are used by vacationers who move between residential dwellings and hotels. We have evidence of their use by military members as they deploy from their homes and bases to war zones.